The sun was setting over Newton Heights, casting long shadows across its pristine streets lined with million-dollar homes. Officer Michael Wilson had been patrolling these quiet neighborhoods for over 12 years, and he prided himself on knowing every street, every corner, and most importantly, every face that belonged there. It was a peaceful Sunday afternoon in March 2023, the kind of day where residents usually spent time in their backyards having barbecues or walking their perfectly groomed dogs. The cherry blossoms were just beginning to bloom, adding splashes of pink to the tree-lined streets. Officer Wilson was doing his usual rounds in his patrol car, the steady hum of the engine mixing with the soft murmur of the police radio. As he turned onto Maple Drive, something caught his attention. Through his side window, he noticed a man walking down the sidewalk. The man was wearing an expensive-looking charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Wilson's monthly salary. He moved with confidence, occasionally checking his phone and glancing at the house numbers as if looking for a specific address. Under normal circumstances, there would have been nothing unusual about a well-dressed professional walking through a high-end neighborhood. But Officer Wilson had developed what he called his cop instincts over the years. Something didn't sit right with him, though if asked, he couldn't exactly explain what it was. Maybe it was the way the man seemed too at ease, too comfortable in this predominantly white neighborhood. Or perhaps it was just that Wilson had never seen him before in this area where he knew most faces. Wilson slowed his patrol car, keeping pace with the man while maintaining a distance. He watched as the stranger stopped in front of one of the largest houses on the street, a sprawling colonial with perfectly manicured hedges. The man checked his phone again, then looked up at the house number, making a note of something. That was enough for Wilson. He'd seen too many cases of sophisticated burglaries where the perpetrators dressed up as professionals to case expensive homes. At least, that's what he told himself as he pulled his cruiser to the curb, the tires crunching softly against the perfectly swept street. The afternoon was quiet enough that the sound of his car door opening echoed slightly between the houses. Wilson adjusted his belt as he stepped out, straightening his posture to its full height. He could feel the familiar weight of his badge and gun, reminders of his authority and responsibility to protect this neighborhood. "Excuse me, sir," Wilson called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a veteran officer. He noticed how the man turned to face him calmly, without the nervous jump that usually accompanied guilty consciences. The man's suit, Wilson could now see, was perfectly tailored, and his shoes were handmade Italian leather, details that would normally suggest he belonged in this neighborhood, but somehow made Wilson even more suspicious. The cool spring breeze rustled through the cherry blossoms overhead, scattering pale pink petals across the sidewalk as Officer Wilson approached. He didn't know it yet, but this routine stop on a quiet Sunday afternoon was about to become anything but routine. In fact, it would become the kind of moment that would not only change his life, but would soon make headlines across the country and spark conversations in police departments nationwide. What happened in the next few minutes would challenge everything Wilson thought he knew about policing, about his instincts, and about the assumptions that had guided his 12 years on the force. But for now, he was just a cop approaching a man he deemed suspicious, about to make the biggest mistake of his career. As he got closer, Wilson's hand instinctively rested on his belt, close to his holster, a habit born from years of training and experience. The man stood his ground, his expression neutral but evaluating. There was something in his eyes that Wilson couldn't quite read, a quiet confidence that seemed out of place for someone being approached by law enforcement. The scene was set for what would become a pivotal moment in both men's lives, though neither of them knew it yet. The quiet neighborhood of Newton Heights, with its perfect houses and blooming cherry trees, was about to become the stage for a story that would raise uncomfortable questions about prejudice, power, and the complex relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Officer Wilson cleared his throat as he approached the well-dressed stranger. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between them, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed, adding to the suburban symphony of an otherwise peaceful Sunday. "Can I see some identification, sir?" Wilson's voice carried the automatic authority of someone who had made this request thousands of times before. He noticed how the man's expression shifted slightly, not with fear or nervousness, but with something that looked like tired recognition. The man in the suit turned to face Wilson fully, his movements deliberate and calm. "Officer," he began, his voice steady and clear, I'd like to know the reason why you are stopping me." The question was posed professionally, almost like a lawyer might ask it, which only heightened Wilson's suspicion. "I'm conducting a routine check," Wilson replied, taking a step closer. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." This wasn't entirely true. There hadn't been any recent reports, but it was his go-to explanation for stops like this. He used it so many times that it rolled off his tongue without a second thought. The man's eyebrows raised slightly. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I'm curious what suspicious activity you've observed me engaging in." "I'm simply walking down a public street." His tone remained measured, but there was an undercurrent of something else, the voice of someone who had been through this before and knew exactly what was happening. A couple walking their golden retriever on the other side of the street slowed their pace, trying not to appear too obvious as they watched the scene unfold. Wilson felt a flash of irritation, both at the audience and at this man's questioning of his authority. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Please provide your identification." Wilson's hand moved to rest more firmly on his belt, closer to his equipment. The man noticed this supple shift in posture, and his expression hardened slightly. "Officer, I want to be clear that I'm not refusing to identify myself," the man said, maintaining eye contact. "I'm simply exercising my constitutional right to understand why I'm being detained. Based on case law, including Terry v. Ohio, you need reasonable suspicion of criminal activity to demand identification." Wilson felt his face grow warm. In his 12 years on the force, he wasn't used to civilians quoting case law to him. Something about this man's calm confidence, his expensive suit, and his legal knowledge was making Wilson increasingly uncomfortable and increasingly determined to assert his authority. "Listen," Wilson said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "if you don't provide identification right now, I'll have to assume you're hiding something." He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. The couple with the golden retriever had stopped pretending not to watch and were now openly staring. The man in the suit sighed, but it wasn't a sigh of submission, it was one of resignation, as if he'd been here before and knew exactly how this would play out. "Officer, I work in law enforcement myself, and I'm happy to show you my credentials, but I want it noted that you've provided no legitimate reason for this stop." Wilson's heart skipped a beat at the mention of law enforcement, but he was too far committed now to back down. More neighbors had appeared on their porches, drawn by the tension in the air. The cherry blossoms continued to fall around them, nature's quiet commentary on the scene unfolding below. "Put your hands where I can see them," Wilson commanded, his voice rising slightly. "Turn around and face the wall." The man's claim about working in law enforcement had to be a lie. A desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of his defiance. Wilson had heard every excuse in the book over his years on the force. The man slowly raised his hands, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Officer, I want to be very clear about what's happening here. You're about to make a serious mistake. I am a federal agent, and I'm here conducting an official investigation." But Wilson wasn't listening anymore. All he could hear was the blood rushing in his ears and the voice of his wounded pride. He reached for his handcuffs, the metal catching the late afternoon sun. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, and several phones were now raised, recording the incident. As Wilson moved to place the handcuffs on the man's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this stop. The man's unusual confidence, his knowledge of the law, his claim about being a federal agent, it all added up to something, but Wilson's pride wouldn't let him step back and see the bigger picture. The click of the handcuffs echoed off the colonial houses, a sound that would soon reverberate far beyond this quiet street in Newton Heights. As Wilson began to recite the Miranda rights, he had no idea that he was setting in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life, but would become a national conversation about law enforcement, bias, and the abuse of power. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting an orange glow over the scene. The cherry blossoms continued their gentle descent, oblivious to the gravity of what was unfolding beneath them. And Officer Wilson, still convinced he was simply doing his job, was about to learn a lesson that no amount of police training could have prepared him for. The crowd of onlookers had grown to about a dozen people now, their phones recording every moment of what was quickly becoming a tense situation. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, creating an oddly beautiful backdrop for the unfolding drama on Maple Drive. With his hands now cuffed behind his back, the well-dressed man maintained his composure, though his jaw was set firmly. "Officer Wilson," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "I'm going to reach for my credentials very slowly. They're in my inner jacket pocket." "Don't move," Wilson snapped, his hand firmly on the man's shoulder. The officer's face had grown red, partly from the tension of the moment and partly from the embarrassment of having an audience. He could hear the murmurs from the gathering crowd, could feel their judging eyes on his back. A silver-haired woman standing on her porch spoke up. "Officer, this is ridiculous. I've never seen anything like this in our neighborhood." Her voice trembled with indignation. Wilson tried to ignore her, but her words added to the pressure building inside him. "Ma'am, please stay back," Wilson called out, trying to maintain control of the situation. "This is a police matter." His words were met with more disapproving murmurs from the crowd. Someone in the back shouted, "This is wrong, and you know it." The man in handcuffs took a slow, deep breath. "Officer Wilson, my name is Agent Robert Chen. I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If you check my credentials, you'll find that I'm here conducting an official investigation into a series of white-collar crimes in this neighborhood." Wilson's stomach did a small flip at the mention of the FBI, but he pushed the feeling down. In his experience, people would say anything to avoid arrest. He'd heard claims of being undercover cops, federal agents, even CIA before. But something about this man's calm certainty made this feel different. "Yeah, right," Wilson scoffed, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "And I'm the Attorney General." He reached for his radio to call for backup, but his hand was trembling slightly. The crowd had grown larger, and the number of recording phones had multiplied. Agent Chen spoke again, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Officer, I understand you're doing what you think is right. But in about 10 minutes, your department is going to receive a call from the FBI field office. Things are going to get very complicated for you very quickly. You still have time to handle this professionally." A bead of sweat rolled down Wilson's back despite the cool evening air. The agent's words carried too much specific detail to be a simple bluff. But Wilson was in too deep now. Admitting a mistake would mean losing face in front of all these people. His pride wouldn't let him back down. "If you're really FBI," Wilson said, trying to sound confident, "then you'll understand that I need to verify your identity back at the station." He tugged slightly on the handcuffs, gesturing for the agent to start walking toward the patrol car. Just then, Wilson's radio crackled to life. "Unit 247, be advised, we're receiving a call from the FBI field office regarding." Wilson's heart sank as the dispatcher's voice confirmed his growing fears. But he was already committed to this course of action. The crowd had fallen silent, sensing that something significant was happening. The only sounds were the chirping of early evening birds and the soft click of phone cameras. Agent Chen stood perfectly still, neither resisting nor cooperating, simply waiting for the inevitable to unfold. "Officer," Agent Chen said quietly, so only Wilson could hear, "I want you to understand something. What's happening right now isn't just about you and me. This moment is going to become part of a much larger conversation. How you handle the next few minutes will determine a lot about your future in law enforcement." Wilson felt the weight of those words settle onto his shoulders like a heavy blanket. His mouth had gone dry, and his earlier certainty was crumbling by the second. The radio crackled again, this time with his surgeon's voice, asking for an immediate update on his location. The cherry blossoms continued their gentle descent around them, oblivious to the tension below. A cool evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the weight of impending consequences. Officer Wilson stood frozen in place, his hand still on Agent Chen's shoulder, as the reality of his situation began to sink in. He had made a terrible mistake, and now, with a dozen cameras recording and his radio demanding responses, he had to decide how to handle it. His next actions would either salvage something from this situation or completely destroy his career. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across Maple Drive as Officer Wilson faced the most critical decision of his professional life. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Wilson led Agent Chen through the front doors. The evening shift desk sergeant looked up from his computer, his eyes widening at the sight of a handcuffed man in an expensive suit being led in by a visibly nervous Wilson. "What do we have here?" the sergeant asked, rising from his chair. Before Wilson could answer, the phone on the sergeant's desk rang. The sergeant picked it up, his expression changing from curiosity to concern as he listened to the voice on the other end. "Yes, sir. Yes, he's right here. Yes, I understand the severity." The sergeant's face grew increasingly pale as the conversation continued. He placed his hand over the receiver and looked at Wilson. "Remove those cuffs, now." Wilson's fingers trembled slightly as he fumbled with the handcuff keys. The station had grown eerily quiet, with other officers and staff stopping their work to watch the scene unfold. The click of the handcuffs being removed seemed to echo through the room. Agent Chen rolled his shoulders as he brought his hands forward, his face maintaining the same calm composure he'd shown on Maple Drive. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a black leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal the gold FBI badge and credentials that Wilson had refused to look at earlier. The desk sergeant hung up the phone and immediately picked it up again, dialing an internal number. "Get the chief down here." Now, his voice was tight with urgency. Turning to Agent Chen, he had adopted a completely different tone. "Sir, please accept our sincerest apologies. We'll have this sorted out immediately." Wilson stood rooted to the spot, watching as his entire world began to crumble around him. The other officers in the station were either staring openly or trying very hard to look busy while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. The air conditioning hummed in the background, a mundane sound that seemed surreal against the gravity of the moment. Within minutes, the station's double doors burst open, and Chief Thompson strode in, still wearing his golf clothes, clearly called away from his Sunday afternoon plans. His face was already red with anger, having been briefed on the phone about the situation. "Agent Chen," the chief said, extending his hand. "I cannot begin to express how sorry we are for this incident." The chief's attempt at professional courtesy couldn't quite mask the tremor of panic in his voice. This was the kind of incident that ended careers and sparked federal investigations. Agent Chen shook the chief's hand firmly. "Chief Thompson, I appreciate your prompt response. As I'm sure you're aware, this situation goes beyond a simple misunderstanding. Officer Wilson had no probable cause for the stop, no reasonable suspicion for detention, and refused to examine readily available credentials that would have prevented this escalation." The chief nodded gravely, shooting a withering look at Wilson. "Officer Wilson will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." He turned to Wilson. "Hand over your badge and gun, now." Wilson's hands moved automatically, as if they belonged to someone else. The weight of his badge and gun had been so familiar for 12 years that removing them felt like losing a part of himself. The equipment made a dull thud as he placed them on the sergeant's desk. Meanwhile, the station had erupted into controlled chaos. Phones were ringing off the hook as news of the incident spread. The videos taken by residents were already circulating on social media, and local news vans were beginning to arrive outside the station. "Sir," a young officer interrupted, holding a tablet. "You might want to see this." He turned the screen toward the chief, showing a social media feed where one of the videos from Maple Drive had already garnered thousands of views and shares. The chief's face grew even redder. "Get the PR team in here immediately. And someone contact the mayor's office." He turned back to Agent Chen. "Sir, would you join me in my office? We need to discuss how to address this situation." As Agent Chen followed the chief toward his office, he paused briefly next to Wilson. "Officer," he said quietly, "I hope you understand that what happened today isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been stopped without cause, who didn't happen to have an FBI badge to prove they belonged." Wilson felt the full weight of those words settle onto his shoulders. Through the station's windows, he could see the news vans multiplying, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky. The evening sun cast long shadows through the blinds, creating prison bar patterns across the floor. Standing alone in the middle of the station, Wilson realized that this wasn't just the worst day of his career. It was a moment that would force him to confront everything he thought he knew about being a police officer. The buzz of the fluorescent lights continued overhead, indifferent to the fact that beneath them, a 12-year career was crumbling, and a national conversation about policing was about to begin. The conference room felt smaller than Wilson had ever remembered it. He sat alone at the large table, his coffee growing cold in front of him, while through the glass walls, He could see the station buzzing with frantic activity. The sun had fully set now, but the day was far from over. The TV mounted on the wall was tuned to the local news, though mercifully muted. Wilson watched his own face appear on the screen, a photo from last year's police award ceremony. Next to it was footage from Maple Drive, shaky phone videos showing him confronting Agent Chen. The subtitle below read, "Local Officer Arrests FBI Agent, Claims of Racial Profiling Surface." His phone hadn't stopped vibrating with messages from fellow officers, family, and friends who had seen the news. He couldn't bring himself to look at any of them. The weight of what he'd done was starting to sink in, making it hard to breathe in his suddenly too tight uniform, the uniform he might never wear again. Outside the conference room, he could see reporters gathering in the station's lobby, their cameras and microphones ready. The department's public relations officer was trying to manage the situation, but the story had already exploded. Social media was ablaze with the videos, and national news outlets were picking up the story. A gentle knock on the door pulled Wilson from his thoughts. It was Officer Garcia, his partner for the last 3 years. She entered without waiting for a response, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said, replacing his cold cup with a hot one. "Thanks," Wilson mumbled, but couldn't meet her eyes. They'd been through countless shifts together, had each other's backs in dangerous situations, shared stories about their families. Now he could feel her disappointment like a physical presence in the room. "The chief's still in with Agent Chen and the FBI liaison," Garcia said, sitting down across from him. "The mayor's on his way." She paused, stirring her coffee. "Want to talk about what happened out there?" Wilson ran his hands over his face, feeling the day's stubble beneath his palms. "I messed up," he said simply. "I saw him in that neighborhood, and I made assumptions. 12 years on the force, and I let prejudice cloud my judgment." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Through the glass, they could see more officers arriving for the evening shift, being briefed on the situation. The story was spreading through the department like wildfire. "You know what the hardest part is?" Wilson continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "When he told me he was FBI, there was this voice in my head saying check his credentials, but I was so sure I was right, so convinced he was lying. I couldn't admit I might be wrong." Garcia nodded slowly. "Pride's a dangerous thing in this job," she said. "We all make mistakes, but—" She trailed off, leaving the obvious unspoken, that this was more than just a mistake. The conference room door opened again. This time it was Lieutenant Davis, his face grim. "Wilson, the chief wants to see you in his office. The FBI's Internal Affairs Division is here." He paused, then added more softly, "You might want to call your union rep." As Wilson stood to leave, Garcia touched his arm. "Hey," she said, "whatever happens, use this. Learn from it. Make it mean something." Walking through the station felt like running a gauntlet. Some officers couldn't meet his eyes, while others stared openly. The civilian staff whispered as he passed. He caught fragments of conversations about sensitivity training, departmental reviews, and federal investigations. The chief's office door looked more imposing than ever. Through the frosted glass, Wilson could see several figures waiting inside. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob, and he took a moment to steady himself. Just then, a custodian passed by, pushing his cleaning cart. The man, who Wilson had seen every evening for years but had never really noticed before, gave him a lone look. There was no anger in his eyes, just a deep sadness that seemed to say, "I could have told you this day was coming." Wilson thought about all the times he'd made stops like today's, all the people he approached with suspicion simply because they didn't fit his idea of who belonged in certain neighborhoods. How many times had he been wrong? How many times had he made someone feel less than human because of his assumptions? The weight of those realizations pressed down on him as he opened the chief's door. The room was crowded with serious faces: the chief, Agent Chen, 2 FBI Internal Affairs officers, the department's legal counsel, and the mayor himself, who had apparently just arrived. As Wilson stepped into the office, he knew his career in law enforcement would never be the same. But maybe, he thought, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe this was the wake-up call not just he, but the entire department needed. The question was, would they learn from it, or would it just become another headline that faded with time? The chief gestured for him to sit down, and as the door closed behind him, Wilson could hear the hum of the news helicopters circling outside, broadcasting this story to the world. His story. Their story. A story that was about to become part of a much larger conversation about power, prejudice, and the need for change in American law enforcement. The weeks following the incident moved both incredibly fast and painfully slow. Wilson spent most of his days in his small apartment, watching as his story played out on national news. His uniform hung untouched in his closet, a reminder of everything he'd lost. The department's internal affairs office had taken over the third-floor conference room, transforming it into a command center for their investigation. Filing cabinets were rolled in, computers were set up, and teams of investigators began the painstaking process of reviewing Wilson's entire career. "We need to go through every stop, every arrest, every complaint," Lieutenant Baker from Internal Affairs explained to the chief during one of their morning briefings. The walls of the conference room were now covered with timeline charts and statistical breakdowns. "We're seeing a pattern emerge, and it's not pretty." The numbers told a story Wilson had never wanted to see. Over his 12 years on the force, he had conducted significantly more stops of minorities in predominantly white neighborhoods. The data was there in black and white, impossible to ignore or explain away. His body camera footage from the incident with Agent Chen had gone viral, viewed millions of times across social media platforms. News channels played it on loop, experts analyzed every word and gesture, and commentators debated the broader implications for law enforcement across the country. One morning, about 3 weeks into the investigation, Wilson's former partner Garcia called him. "They're going through everything," she said, her voice tired. "Remember that stop we made last year on Oak Street? The one with the college student?" They've interviewed him too. Wilson remembered. Another black man in another wrong neighborhood. He'd let that student go with a warning, feeling generous at the time. Now he realized that there shouldn't have been a stop at all. The understanding came too late, but it came with crushing clarity. The FBI had launched their own parallel investigation, focusing not just on Wilson, but on departmental practices as a whole. Agent Chen, it turned out, had been investigating white-collar crimes in the area when Wilson stopped him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. While looking for actual criminals, he became the victim of prejudiced policing. In the police station's break room, officers gathered around the coffee machine, their conversations hushed but intense. "They're saying this could lead to a complete departmental overhaul," one veteran officer whispered. "New training protocols, external oversight, the works." The investigation uncovered more than just Wilson's bias. It revealed a department culture that had allowed such practices to go unchecked for years. Officers had rarely questioned the basis for their stops, and supervisors had failed to notice or address problematic patterns. Community meetings were held in the city hall, packed with concerned citizens demanding change. The mayor sat through hours of testimony from residents sharing similar stories of being stopped, questioned, and made to feel like criminals in their own neighborhoods. One evening, as Wilson watched another news report about his case, his phone rang. It was his mother. "I raised you better than this," she said, her voice breaking. "But you can still make it right. You can help make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Her words stuck with him as he prepared for his formal interview with Internal Affairs. The department had assigned him a union lawyer, but Wilson had decided to be completely honest about everything. No excuses, no justifications, just the truth about his actions and the thinking behind them. The interview room felt colder than usual that morning. Wilson sat across from 2 Internal Affairs investigators and an FBI agent, a video camera recording everything. "Officer Wilson," the lead investigator began, "we'd like you to walk us through your thought process when you first saw Agent Chen." For the next 4 hours, Wilson answered every question truthfully. He explained his assumptions, his biases, and the moment-by-moment decisions that led to the arrest. It was like therapy in a way, pulling apart years of ingrained thinking and laying it bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. "I saw a black man in an expensive suit in a white neighborhood," Wilson admitted, his voice steady but filled with shame. "And instead of considering innocent explanations, I immediately assumed he didn't belong there. I let my biases override my training, my judgment, and basic human decency." The investigators scribbled notes as Wilson continued to talk. He told them about other stops he'd made, times he used the same flawed reasoning, moments he now recognized as clear examples of biased policing. Each admission felt like removing a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. Outside the station, life went on. The cherry blossoms on Maple Drive had given way to full leaves, but the impact of what happened there continued to ripple through the community. The department had already begun implementing changes, new training programs, revised protocols for stops, and mandatory bias awareness sessions. As the sun set on another day of investigations, Wilson stood at his apartment window, watching the city lights come on. His story had become more than just a cautionary tale about one officer's mistake. It had sparked a national conversation about police reform, about the need for accountability, and about the long journey toward truly equal justice. The investigation would continue for several more weeks, but the truth was already clear. The question now wasn't just about one officer's future in law enforcement, it was about how to prevent the next Wilson, the next biased stop, the next moment where prejudice overwhelmed protection and service. 6 months after the incident on Maple Drive, the police department's main conference room was packed with reporters. The chief stood at the podium, flanked by the mayor and several community leaders. Behind them, a large screen displayed the department's new comprehensive reform program. Today, we're announcing sweeping changes to our departmental policies and training procedures, the chief began, his voice carrying the weight of the past 6 months. What happened that Sunday afternoon was a wake-up call, not just for our department, but for law enforcement agencies across the country. In the back of the room, Wilson sat quietly, wearing civilian clothes. He was no longer a police officer. That chapter of his life had ended with his official termination 3 months ago. But he wasn't there as a spectator. He had been asked to be part of the solution. The chief continued, outlining the changes. Every officer will undergo enhanced training on bias recognition and prevention. We're implementing new protocols for stops and searches, with regular audits to identify potential patterns of biased policing. But perhaps most importantly, we're changing how we measure success in our department. The screen behind him showed graphs and statistics, not of arrest numbers or citation counts, but of community engagement metrics, response times, and positive interaction reports. It was a fundamental shift in how the department viewed its role in the community. Agent Chen, who had become a crucial partner in the reform process, stepped up to the podium next. "What happened to me that day was unfortunately not unique," he said, his voice steady. "What is unique is how this department chose to respond. Instead of becoming defensive, they chose to learn and grow." The changes weren't just on paper. The department had already begun working with community organizations to create bridge-building programs. Officers were now required to spend time each month in community service roles, getting to know the neighborhoods they patrolled as people, not just territories. Wilson's role in all this was unexpected. After his termination, he had been approached by the department's training division. They wanted him to share his story with new recruits to help them understand how bias can cloud judgment and how quickly a career can end when prejudice overtakes professionalism. "I stand before you as an example of what not to do," Wilson would tell each new class of recruits, "but also as proof that these biases exist in all of us, and we must actively work to recognize and overcome them." The media coverage of the incident had led to other departments across the country examining their own practices. Police chiefs from several major cities had visited to learn about the reforms being implemented. The incident on Maple Drive was becoming a case study in police training academies nationwide. In the months following his termination, Wilson had done a lot of soul-searching. He'd started volunteering at a community center in one of the neighborhoods he used to patrol, seeing it through new eyes. The same young men he might have once viewed with suspicion were now teaching him about their lives, their challenges, and their aspirations. One of the most significant changes was the creation of a civilian oversight committee with real power to review police actions. The committee included members from all parts of the community, ensuring that multiple perspectives were considered in departmental decisions. "We're not just changing policies," the mayor explained to the reporters. "We're changing the culture of law enforcement in our city. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about creating a police force that truly serves and protects everyone equally." The changes weren't always easy. Some officers resigned rather than adapt to the new requirements. Others initially resisted but gradually came to embrace the new approach as they saw positive results in their daily interactions with the community. As the press conference concluded, Wilson found himself face to face with Agent Chen. The two men had spoken several times during the investigation and reform process, each conversation more meaningful than the last. "You know," Agent Chen said, "what happened that day could have just been another incident that got swept under the rug. Instead, it became a catalyst for real change. That's not because of what I did, it's because of how you chose to respond to it afterward." Wilson nodded, thinking about his journey over the past 6 months. He'd lost his badge, but he'd gained something more valuable, a true understanding of the responsibility that comes with serving the public and the importance of seeing every person's humanity. The sun was setting outside the station, casting long shadows through the windows. On Maple Drive, new cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom, a reminder that growth and renewal are always possible. The incident that ended Wilson's police career had opened a new chapter in police community relations, not just in their city, but across the nation. As Wilson left the station that evening, he passed a group of new recruits arriving for their evening training session. They would learn about his story tonight, not as a simple cautionary tale, but as proof that from the biggest mistakes can come the most important lessons. The path to change is never easy, but as the past 6 months had shown, it's a journey worth taking.